I'm very pleased to be joined by Errol Louis, whose column appears in the New York Daily News. Errol's a native New Yorker, taught college, and in addition to being a journalist, is also an attorney and even once was a candidate for the New York City Council. Welcome to CityWide.
Good to be here.
So do you consider yourself an on-ink personality or a journalist?
Oh, I consider myself a writer, actually. It's something I've wanted to do since I was 5 years old. I happen to write for the only kind of publication that will regularly publish nonfiction essays, which is a daily newspaper.
And tell us a little bit about how you got from being a 5-year-old to a columnist for the Daily News.
Well, oddly enough, I actually have been writing, in college when I was 19, I was writing columns three times a week. Very similar, very similar to what I'm doing now. In fact, a lot of it is online now, so anybody who feels like digging through the website, you go back to the Harvard Crimson in the 1980s, I was writing about local politics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I got into this because there was an opportunity to do some journalism in downtown Brooklyn. Actually, it was my first job out of college. I said no to an offer from Dow Jones, from the Wall Street Journal, and went with a now defunct newspaper called the City Sun.
Andrew Cooper?
Andrew Cooper, the late Andrew Cooper, who was a wonderful guy and a former candidate for office, as a matter of fact, politically active. And he opened up shop on Joralemon Street, right near Court. And he had a small team of us who just ran around and made as much trouble as we could. And just about everybody came out of that just fine. You know, it was like dog years. So the 6 months that I spent there were really the equivalent of 2 or 3 years. Other people there included Dan Jacobson, who's now the managing editor at New York One, Joe Sexton, who's now the Metro editor for the New York Times. I mean, it was a real interesting class. It was a real interesting time to be doing that kind of journalism. And we were doing neighborhood journalism, kind of bumping up against the Amsterdam News, competing, in that ethnic niche market. And then from there, I kind of went on a detour through school and went to graduate school and got into politics and community activism and different kinds of things. But I always did a little freelancing on the side, kind of stayed with it. And when the New York Sun started up in April of 2002, I was friends with the publisher and contacted him, offered to write a column. It was something that I just love to do it. I mean, I mean it. I've always wanted to be a writer. And he gave me a column once a week, and then he asked me to do it twice a week, and then he kind of started reeling me in, and I got involved in a lot of other things, and I eventually returned to the one thing I actually am trained to do. I mean, I've done a lot of different things, but the one thing I really was trained to do was to work in daily journalism.
We've been talking a lot about the media this season on CityWide. We've had editors, we've had cartoonists, we've had publicists on. Talk a little bit about the job of being a columnist, the journalism component of it, the advocacy component of it, and sort of what the lifestyle is like.
I think it's just the best job at a newspaper, frankly. Better than all except being the owner. A journalist normally has to do certain kind of things which we columnists are not exempt from. You have to get the facts right. You have to be somewhere within the news cycle, meaning it has to be sort of timely, this week as opposed to next week, that kind of a thing. But there's a chance to expand a little bit and to bring in things from the past, to bring in your own personal experience, to put some of your own opinion in, to push the discussion about a particular issue in a particular direction and to explain why. And to just kind of, sort of put your heart and soul out there. So I've written a series of articles about crime in my neighborhood in Crown Heights. But rather than just talk about the statistics or to go and interview a family that's been affected by crime, and I'll do those things, but I also talk about raising my son in that neighborhood. I talk about, when my father came to the neighborhood and bought a house in the 1950s. I talk about what I've seen, and it adds a richness, I think, to the overall discussion. It offers the readers another way to look at their life in this city, to look at the city that we all love, and to understand it maybe from a slightly different perspective. So, one of the things you always want to do is to challenge the readers to maybe look at it from a different point of view. The experience when it works can be wonderful.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Daily News, because when I was growing up in Brooklyn, it was the working class paper. It had a conservative voice. It spoke to a demographic that might not be as prevalent in the city as it was. I would think that the editorial voices of a newspaper are often like a baseball team. You have to have different people filling different positions. So what position did the Daily News think that they were filling when they hired you?
Well, there's what they told me, and then there's what they got. They asked me to sort of come on and to write a Metro column. And so that's what I do. I try to keep it within the 5 boroughs, although there are lots of things that go on here, from the United Nations to every celebrity that comes through here that are national or international.
Because those are all local stories in New York.
Well, that's right. And everywhere else, they're seen as worldwide stories. But I also, my job is, sort of, I wear 2 hats. I'm on the editorial board. So I'm at the morning meeting every morning where we try and hash out what the voice of the paper will say. And that's literally 10 people all coming from different perspectives, kind of mixing it up on various issues, national, local, international. I probably lose way more than fights than I win in that setting, but it's understood that it's a process, it's a conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. And my view, when it's not that of the paper, will often end up in the column. When it is the voice of the paper, and people who read very closely, I think, can tell some of the editorials that I have written on certain land use issues, certain neighborhood issues, certain political conversations that I've been a part of for a long, long time. But I think of myself as really just kind of somebody who has a lot invested in this city, wants to be here, and has the kind of common sense that real New Yorkers have. I'm not ideologically easily tagged. I end up, like most black Democrats, I guess I'm probably on the more liberal side, if you wanted to use that scale, on most issues. But, you ask me about public safety in my neighborhood. You ask me about economic development, the need for jobs in the neighborhood, the need to build up this city, to not turn Brooklyn, into a 19th century museum where nothing ever changes. And I'll pretty much upset almost everybody once in a while, just because I don't really have those kind of boxes. You can't do it that way. I mean, to write 125 columns a year, you really can't. You can't do it with any variety if you're in a box.
Let me ask you a little bit about the writing voice, if you will, and we'll get into some of the issues that you've written about in a second. But there was a breakthrough, I think, in the late 60s, the early 70s, where the new journalism, the telling of a story, whether it was a Norman Mailer or Jimmy Breslin, Pete Hamill, it was no longer who, what, when, where, and why, the traditional journalistic format. And being able to be a great storyteller evolved as a new form of column writing, I think. It wasn't Walter Winchell bold-faced names. It was now looking inside of a family. Where do you draw your writing experience from? You mentioned that you've been doing it since you were in college. I've always wanted to do it. But in terms of the kind of role models that you would look to, or other writers that you admire, who do you draw on?
Oh, well, I mean, I've read closely and stolen from almost all of the people that you mentioned. I mean, Hamill, Breslin, Jack Newfield was a personal mentor of mine, Wayne Barrett. I learned about the city by reading these guys years ago. And as well as some hard news writers that maybe a lot of viewers aren't familiar with, because they didn't develop a big reputation as columnists, but they're still really important, excellent journalists. Tom Robbins and Arthur Brown, who's the chair of my editorial board at the Daily News. I mean, these guys went out and just really did this thing when it was really all in formation. The people who saw this city through the fiscal crisis, the journalists who covered that, I mean, they did an incredible service by making sure, Fortune City dropped dead, that the emotional tone and the reality of what was going on was really covered. So I follow all of those people. I also, have stolen quite a bit from George Orwell, some of the great essayists of all kinds that anybody in their right mind would want to study and want to copy. It's very much a case of, coming up to bat. I write a column twice a week. Coming up to bat twice a week and trying your very best within 500 words to do something that, might survive the subway trip home, that somebody might want to look at a year or two from now and say, you know what, this guy had his finger on what was going on in the city that week, that day.
My sense is that one of the reasons that you were attractive to the news was that it was a contemporary voice. You're not you're not writing nostalgia about the city. You're not writing about the neighborhoods that were and what happened and why is my neighborhood changing the way some columnists do. You're writing about what's happening today in the neighborhoods where you live and in the other areas you're familiar with.
Well, that's right. I mean, anybody in Brooklyn, I mean, and I live about 5 blocks from Ebbets Field, you know, so anybody in Brooklyn can fall into that nostalgia trap that is you know, it's in its place. It has its place, but it's not what this city is about. I mean, I'm always looking forward. Yeah, I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of problems. It had the highest homicide rate in the city last year, the 7-1 precinct. I live in the 7-7, which is next door, but it's all Crown Heights. Crown Heights is where those riots were in 1991. The largest men's shelter in Brooklyn, one of the biggest in the city. 350 homeless guys are right near my front door. You know, there are a lot of things there that need to change. And if you're interested in change, and I've tried it through academia and through politics and so forth, but to be a columnist at a great daily newspaper is a wonderful, wonderful platform and stage and opportunity to try and push this city in a different direction on big issues, small issues. Should there be more trees planted on this block, or should we overhaul the tax structure? You know, all of those things are fair game, and I'm in it up to my elbows, and I love it.
We're going to talk about some of those big issues and small issues that are on Errol Louis's computer screen when CityWide continues right after this.
Are your kids getting enough art? Whether through poetry, dance, music, or drama, the arts open the doors to creativity. As a mother and teacher, I know that arts education can help our children develop confidence and a better understanding of the world around them. Even if you have just 30 minutes a week, get your kids more involved in the arts and think about the kind of world we can leave behind for our children and our children's children.
Art. Ask for more. AmericansForTheArts.org.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with New York Daily News columnist Errol Louis. So you live in Crown Heights. You write a lot about Crown Heights. For a lot of folks who lived in New York in 1990, 1991, the Crown Heights riots were the defining moment and one of those critical times in New York City's history. I would venture to guess, though, that given the number of people who have moved into New York since those days, in the last 10 years or so, that it doesn't resonate quite the same way with those newcomers. So tell us a little bit about what Crown Heights is today.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's not what it was in that sense. There are a lot of people coming in, especially on the western end, where Crown Heights sort of fades into Prospect Heights. There's a wave of prosperity that's coming in. There are a lot of people who have been moving from Park Slope, from Brooklyn Heights, from Manhattan, looking for lower housing prices, and they're finding them there. There's also the big change. One of the big changes is the death of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Crown Heights. So there's been this kind of 4 or 5-way power struggle going on over there. So that community has been going through some change as well. There have been a lot of immigrants coming in. The Haitian and other Caribbean immigrants into the neighborhood have continued apace. And you know, the good side of all of this has been, in my part, the northern part of Crown Heights, which was traditionally just African American and Caribbean, is actually slowly desegregating. You know, where you actually have some interchange now. Some people who have decided to try and set down roots in a neighborhood that had gone from being sort of Jewish and Swedish to Black and Caribbean, and now is kind of settling into a new kind of diversity pattern.
So talk to me a little bit about the concept of who owns a neighborhood. Because one of the things that you see now popping up in many different contexts is the notion of it's not our community, the people who are coming into our community are not. I grew up in Prospect Heights. I grew up near Grand Army Plaza, not far from where you live. And the neighborhood changed while my folks were living there. And I suspect that if I moved into the neighborhood today, I would be viewed, given my age and my demographics, as somewhat of an interloper. So, is it a good thing that the neighborhoods are desegregating, or does it mean that the people who worked hard to make Crown Heights what it is today are losing out on the benefits?
Well, no, I don't. I said before that I end up with positions that people don't necessarily like, but all of my housing friends get mad at me for saying this. But the reality is, I live on a block where people stuck it out through crack, through really hard times, and there are a lot of homeowners on my block. So when I see newcomers come in and pay high prices for property, I'm not thinking about the new person who's come in. I'm thinking about the person who now has a secure retirement, whether it's in Jamaica or South Carolina or wherever it is they choose to go.
But whose kids may not be able to afford to live in that neighborhood.
Well, that's true. That's true. Their kids may not be able to afford it, or their kids may have done what I did, which was come back when I didn't have any money. I mean, I had a college degree and a job at a startup newspaper that I didn't keep for very long, and I chose to literally sweep the crack vials off the steps of the brownstone and settle in and put up with what were really kind of crazy times back then in the 90s. And try and make a life there, and I've gotten married and had a kid, and we're going to try and make a go of it. But the fact that the city's not affordable, it can't be everybody's problem on every block. I think, when I think about my neighborhood and kind of what is happening to it, it certainly has by no means reached the point where lots and lots of people are being forced out because of escalating rents. Quite the opposite, really. It's where you go when you can't make it anymore in Fort Greene or in Park Slope. So for now, there's not that much transition.
Some of this dynamic change has been incremental. Some of it comes in spurts. The city has rezoned big parts of the Brooklyn waterfront. Downtown is becoming more of a destination, cultural center, art scene in Fort Greene. And it seems now to have set the stage for a rather large project called Atlantic Yards. What do you think Atlantic Yards is going to mean for your neighborhood, for Brooklyn, for the city?
Well, I'm hoping. I mean, the most conservative estimates have thousands of jobs being created there, and thousands of jobs being there for a good 10 years. And that's good enough for me all by itself. But there'll also be, under the plans, 6,800 new housing units, at least a third of which are going to be affordable in some very creative kind of ways. And then I guess most of all, those rail yards along Atlantic Avenue, that big ugly scar in the ground, which was that way when you were growing up and when I was growing up, and it's been that way for at least half a century now, will finally be sort of decked over and sort of turned into some kind of usable space. So I think it's a wonderfully exciting project. There's been a lot of controversy over it. There have been people who didn't think that it was worth trying to negotiate around the edges of it, but just flat out tried to kill it. I think those days are over. I think a lot of people feel the way that I do, which is that we can't just kill projects. This is $3.5 billion in a desperately needy area that has a lot of physical work that needed to be done a long time ago. So we've got to get on with it.
So let me, not to get too policy wonkish about it, but let me ask you just a little bit as an observer and as a lawyer and as somebody who's been in the political realm. The process. Some people say it's not about whether the project is a good project or bad project, but the process of using the city's condemnation powers or the state's condemnation powers, the fact that it's not going through the city's normal zoning review, the fact that there wasn't a real competition. Developer comes forward, dangles an arena to get everybody excited. He's bringing a professional sport to New York. And by the way, don't look behind the curtain, but there's all this housing and office buildings back there. Does the process trouble you at all?
Not really. Not really. I mean, the process early on involved a number of people that I know and you probably know from politics. That there are people who have deep roots in the community, who have long established ties, who have a level of integrity that they're not going to just jump at some sort of iffy project. And they looked it over. They signed a community benefits agreement that I think is unique in America, that actually legally obligates the developer to do certain things as far as hiring local businesses, hiring minority and women-owned businesses, giving first crack at jobs to people from the surrounding public housing developments. A lot of good, interesting stuff there. And so the process, to me, unless you're really into process, that you just want it to sort of drag on, what I have found is that a lot of the opponents say that they're concerned about the process, but they're not really being truthful about that they really just want to kill the project. And this happens to be the hook on which they can do it. I mean, in fact, I know that for a fact for a lot of the most prominent opponents. I've sat at forums where they said, well, we're going to sue them and try and stop the project. And I'd ask them, well, on what grounds? What's the theory? So, well, we haven't figured that out yet, but we're going to try and we're going to sue them. So when you hear that kind of thing, there's a certain amount of bad faith involved in some of the complaints about process. I think that's I think almost everybody who's watched this for a while would acknowledge that.
There's also some dynamic change going on in sort of the political structure within Crown Heights and other communities of color around the city. Caribbean Southern black heritage, young versus old, ins versus out, black versus white in some ways. Race seems to wrap around all of it so that there are some people who have standing to talk about these issues and other people who don't. What does that say about where the city is?
Well, this city is has a long overdue conversation about race that needs to at least get started and to move forward. Because, if you watch, say, like some Spike Lee movies, he captures the sort of the patter, the kind of tribal patter where everybody's got their little stereotypes and they fling it around in a good-natured, semi-hostile kind of a way. But underneath that all, New York still is the third most racially segregated city in the country after Milwaukee and Detroit. And I can't get any. I write about this regularly, and I always write about it by introducing it by saying nobody else cares about this, nobody else says anything about it. It's never an issue.
But is it segregation by government or segregation by choice?
It's it's actually hard to draw the line there, to tell you the truth, because every place where you find racial segregation, there's almost always a set of private sector players, an appraiser, a real estate brokerage house, the government that's supposed to regulate them and send in testers and impose fines if they're violating the law and so forth. And everybody's kind of just gone to sleep on it, And I think in New York we get confused because the minute you hit the avenue, the minute you sit down on the train, you're packed, you're up to the, your gills with all kinds of different languages and diversity, but everybody goes home to their little enclaves. And so and the worst thing about that is once you start to have that kind of residential segregation, okay, now if you close a school or a hospital, it's not just a closing, which would be traumatic enough to a community, but now you're closing the hospital in the Jewish community, or you're hurting the school in the Latino community, and it makes every decision that much harder to get to.
We just have a few minutes left, but I want to go from the sort of the political to the personal. Sometimes a story touches you, and you write about it in a kind of personal way. Recently, an example, a 16-year-old girl who disappears and comes to a bad end. Talk a little bit about that experience.
I hope by the time this airs that we will have found who the person or persons who killed Chanel Petro-Nixon. So, a 16-year-old honor student at Boys and Girls High School, avid churchgoer, a good kid by everybody's standards, who left her home on Fulton Street, went down a very busy corridor on a Sunday, 6 o'clock in the evening, which during the summer is broad daylight, to get a job at Applebee's, the only national chain that's come into Bed-Stuy probably in a decade. And she never makes it to her job appointment, and a couple of days later is found strangled to death in a garbage bag on Kingston Avenue. And it's a tragedy that I decided, because this is one of these stories that comes up all the time, I decided that this was not going to be one that I let go. And that's one of the interesting parts about the job, is you have that kind of discretion to put things on the agenda. So I have forced this onto the agenda. I made a personal decision that I was going to see this thing through to the end. I wrote about it immediately. I put her picture in the paper. I told people that I was not going to let it go. The NYPD actually reacted that very day by increasing. Actually, at that point, they had not offered a reward for information, and they created an award of $12,000. And I began calling all the local politicians. I mean, there's no point to having this job if you can't use it once in a while, and there's no point to being at a great paper if you can't put something forward. And in this case, it's just a heartfelt plea to people. Like, if we are letting a 16-year-old kid be violently murdered in this way, and we just move on to the next bit of celebrity news, we've done something just horrible. And we've done the opposite of what most cops and urban planners know is a basic index of safety in a neighborhood. The basic index is, do you see women walking around?
And protect your children.
Yeah, protect your children.
Well, we look forward to reading the rest of that story in the Daily News. My thanks to New York Daily News columnist Errol Louis. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us.